Cultivating a sourdough starter is a pretty charming process, but it can be hard to get started, like in this starter. Do you see that reddish part there? That's how we knew this starter was doomed. What you're seeing is most likely to be Serratia marcescens. It's a potentially harmful bacteria, certainly not the one we're looking for, and because this bacteria is almost everywhere, it's become a common issue in making sourdough starters. Basically, an uninvited guest. In this video on sourdough starters, we're going to show you how to make a sourdough starter correctly and how to prevent these kinds of problems from happening. When we first started out making starters, we ran into quite a few problems ourselves, so if you've been having trouble making sourdough starters, then this video is for you. So let's get started. First, we need to know what a sourdough starter really is. At its core, a starter is made up of wild yeast and lactic acid bacteria cultures. These cultures are what we're looking for in a starter because they're the ones that will both leaven and ferment our bread. The flour and water we give the starter is all just to feed them and get them adapted to the kind of flour we want to use. Now the thing is, these are wild yeast and bacteria cultures, because there's no point in adding instant yeast to the flour and water. That's not a sourdough starter. We have to rely on the yeast and bacteria present in our environment and flour to power our starter. That's part of why sourdough starters can vary so much, depending on your climate, location, and ingredients. The yeast and bacteria in your starter can act quite differently. And this wild aspect is also why it can be so difficult to get a starter actually up and running. First, we need to make sure the conditions in the starter allow the yeast and bacteria to thrive. This means non-chlorinated clean water and flour for food. We also need conducive temperatures for our starter, somewhere above 25 degrees Celsius. Now, the thing about these ideal conditions for the yeast and lactic acid bacteria we want is that they can also serve as ideal conditions for other unwanted microorganisms. This isn't a problem for a mature sourdough starter, because after the yeast and lactic acid bacteria have proliferated and stabilized, they have their own defenses against other microorganisms, namely the alcohol and acid they produce. Most of the harmful bacteria are incapable of thriving in the acidic and alcoholic environment that a mature sourdough starter can achieve. But before the starter matures, while the yeast and lactic acid bacteria have yet to dominate, the starter is vulnerable to other unwanted guests, like the Serratia marcescens you saw at the beginning of this video. So to make a thriving and successful sourdough starter, not only do we need to give the yeast and lactic acid bacteria the right conditions, we also need to prevent other microorganisms from growing. To do that, we've found that adding a little bit of an acidic ingredient such as yogurt or honey can help make the starter more acidic right from the start, which seems to help ward off many potentially harmful bacteria. Although it is true that a starter doesn't truly need anything other than flour and water to get started, sometimes adding some extra ingredients can help the process go more smoothly. So with that preliminary information out of the way, let's immediately start making some sourdough starters. Because we talked about extra ingredients, we're going to be making 3 sourdough starters and just directly comparing them. We'll be making one with just flour and water, a control, and another one will be made with yogurt and flour. Then finally, we'll make one with honey, water, and flour. To make them, there's really not much to prepare. We just need a clean jar, flour, and the liquid we chose. The flour we're using here is bread flour, and while you can use any wheat flour you like to make the starter, it's generally a good idea to use the kind of flour that you plan to make the sourdough bread with. This is to allow the yeast and other cultures to adapt to the flour, so when you finally use the starter in your bread dough, you can get the best results. Now, just mix all ingredients well. And then we want to cover this with something that allows air to pass through. This is not the time to use an airtight container. The yeast and bacteria will produce gases and they need oxygen. So we're using plastic wrap with a few holes poked in. And we repeat this for all the starters until we have 3 newly made starters. We'll also be putting rubber bands on them to track their growth. Green is for the control, the one with just flour and water. Red is for the one with yogurt. And brown is for the one with honey, and then covering it further with a cloth so insects don't fly in. From here on out, to keep the starter alive, we need to maintain it. We'll need to periodically feed or quote-unquote refresh this starter, which is exactly what it sounds like. Once the yeast and bacteria starts running out of food during fermentation, we need to give them some more flour and water. When the starter is mature, this is usually done after the starter has fully risen up and is starting to come down. You'll know it needs to be fed because it'll be very bubbly on top and it will smell slightly acidic. This normally means a feeding every 12 to 24 hours if the starter is at room temperature, although the exact timing depends on your specific sourdough starter. Now, our starters are still very young, literally newborns actually, and they're going to take a while before they properly mature. Right now, the yeast fermentation activity hasn't properly kicked in, so instead of relying on the visual signs, we're just going to leave it for 48 hours first to allow the yeast and lactic acid bacteria to begin spreading. Then we're going to feed them. As you've probably noticed, the one with yogurt in it seems to be rising much faster. This may be due to the heterofermentative lactic acid bacteria producing carbon dioxide and lactic acid. It's probably not the yeast since it's too early for that. Now, after 48 hours, all the starters are showing signs of fermentation activity, as indicated by these bubbles, so it's the right time for us to feed them. Before feeding them with flour and water, though, we need to discard a part of the starters first. This is our way of both managing their size and their acidity. If we didn't regularly discard some of the sourdough starter and still fed them the same amount of food, we would end up with too much yeast and bacteria in the starter with too little food. When we discard a part of the starter, we get to choose how much starter we add to the flour and water, which allows us to control the fermentation process and acidity since we're getting rid of that buildup. After discarding part of the starter, we can add in the flour and water. As for how much flour and water to add, it actually depends on the kind of effect you want to achieve, but the simplest method is just to use a 1:1:1 ratio of starter, flour, and water. So 1 part of each. However many grams of starter you add is the amount of flour and water. This makes for a pretty liquid starter, and if you're familiar with my poulish, it's pretty similar in consistency. This ratio is easy to remember, and it makes the calculations for recipes very easy, which makes it very convenient for beginners, especially if you're just starting out. We mix the flour and water into the starter. Then repeat this process for all starters. After that, all we need to do is cover the starters again and let them sit until the next feeding, which is going to be about 12 hours from now, depending on our weather conditions. The signs we're looking for are what I mentioned before. We want the starter to rise as high as it'll go, and when it starts to come down, that's when we feed it. We're going to be doing this over and over again, so feeding about every 12 hours until these starters fully mature. It's important to note that due to the discard and feeding schedule, all the extra ingredients won't be present in the final matured starter, which is just what we want. They were only there to help the starter in the beginning. Once the starter is up and running, we don't really need these extra ingredients. And again, like I said earlier, starters can vary a lot depending on your conditions, so don't be surprised if your feeding schedule looks different. You just need to keep following it and consistently maintaining the starter until the starter matures. When it matures, the starter's yeast and bacteria cultures will have achieved a stable situation. When this happens, the sourdough starter will not only be sour and tangy, but also predictable in rising and falling, since the yeast cultures will have properly adapted in the starter. The aroma of the sourdough starter should also smell pleasant when it's properly fed. The yeast and lactic acid bacteria ferment the flour and end up creating a lot of flavor and aroma compounds. Among these, the starter may smell buttery at times due to diacetyl. It could also smell fruity and yeasty. When the starter hasn't been fed enough, though, the smell could be less pleasant, with an acetone or alcohol scent. A mature starter will also be capable of rising to 2 or 3 times its height consistently, and its aroma will be very consistent as well. This will be the time to use a starter for whatever bread dough you want to make. To be very sure, before you want to use it, you can double check that it's really ready for use by doing a float test. Take a small amount of starter with a spoon and drop it into a bowl of water. If it floats, then that's a good sign that the starter is ready to use, since the starter is capable of producing enough gas, which is what will leaven your bread. If it sinks, then the starter likely needs more time to ripen or needs to be fed before you can use it. Adding it to the dough in this condition may give you subpar performance. As you can probably see, using the starter at the right time is crucial, and this doesn't just affect the yeast activity, it also affects the taste that the starter gives your bread. The longer it's been since the starter was last fed, the more acidic it will taste. So time your starter's addition to the dough carefully, and you can adjust the sourdough bread's taste to the acidity level you desire. Now, you might not always be able to keep up a twice-a-day feeding schedule for the sourdough starter. That's okay. You can store the starter in the fridge to slow down its fermentation. If you do this, you'll only need to feed the starter every once a week, which can help you reschedule your time. Before you use it, though, to get peak activity, it's best to let it sit at room temperature for 1 to 2 feedings before you add it to your bread dough. And that's it for today. Thanks for watching, and bye!